You see people all over YouTube calling players bust-proof, but then they only give you surface-level reasoning and opinions that really help no one. There is no room in this game for "I feel like" or "I think," because there is a lot of luck in this game. We need to play the percentages and really maximize our chances at winning. Therefore, we deal with straight facts here, homie. So when I plan on talking about bust-proof players, I lay it all on the table. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today, where we have a damn banger of a show today. We're talking about bust-proof players, but what does that mean? Why do we say that term? So let me do my best to define bust-proof to you. Bust-proof means that we have a player that has an established role on the offense they play in, but they're being drafted late enough that even if they don't perform up to expectations, they do not kill your fantasy team. Really, in other words, it means that they are worth the risk that they possess. But this is where I really need you to pay attention to. Eye contact, ears open right here. Because so many times when people are talking about bust-proof players, they're referring to ADP, average draft position. But ADP is always portrayed to what round they're being drafted in. But really, in reality, when it comes to bust-proof players, the spot in which they're drafted at their overall position is what is most important. For example, the running back 20 off the board, or the wide receiver 35 that's being drafted. Because that's the value that we need them to return in our fantasy football drafts. That's what really matters here. You took a player at wide receiver 20. At the end of the season, did he supply you with wide receiver 20 numbers? So let me put all of that together and kind of show you what I mean with a few players. Now, if you're out there watching this show right now and you feel like you're about to mushroom stamp some of your league mates today with all this information, do me a favor and hit the like button right now. But if you want that feeling to happen more often, that's when you need to hit the subscribe button. Because I'll make you a deal. If you subscribe right now to this channel, I will bring you straight bangers every single week of the year. But all right, let's dive into some players. The first one we're talking about is the overall current quarterback 13 in the consensus rankings. It's Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. So let's take a second to talk about Jared Goff. He has back-to-back years as a top 10 fantasy quarterback. Back-to-back years of at least 4,400 passing yards and 29 plus touchdowns. He hasn't missed a game over the last 2 years. He's averaging just under 600 pass attempts a year over the last 2 seasons. He's also averaging 17 fantasy points per game over the last 2 years. He has a big-time threat at running back in Jahmyr Gibbs, a solid overall running back in David Montgomery, a top-tier wide receiver in Amon-Ra St. Brown, a top-tier tight end in last year's tight end one, Sam Laporta. Detroit has been a top 5 NFL offense now for back-to-back seasons. Potentially gonna get some high upside play this year finally from the likes of Jameson Williams as well. He's expected to have a bigger role, and if that happens in this offense, it can only take them to another level. But despite all of that, Jared Goff is currently quarterback 13 off the board. Now, on average, the quarterback 13 scores 266.2 fantasy points per season. I know this because I've already gathered all that data and I've put it into our draft guide. In my opinion, one of the most underrated sections of our draft guide, because once you know how many points a player needs to return value, you can really build some realistic projections and build a better overall team. We can then take those projections and compare them to the player's historical production and apply it to 2024. It's not rocket science. It's very possible to do. So what does that stat line look like for a quarterback to attain 266.2 fantasy points? Well, it's going to put him right in the neighborhood of 4,100 yards passing, 26 total touchdowns, 9 interceptions, and 6 fantasy points somehow in the running game. Well, Jared Goff over the last 2 years has an average of 4,500 passing yards, 29 touchdowns a season, and 9 interceptions, with 10 fantasy points per season in the running game. That comes out to be an average of 297.3 fantasy points per year. That is 31 points higher than the 266.2 he would need to finish as the overall quarterback 13. Let's just be honest here. Things are lining up for an even better situation in Detroit this year than they have been the last couple years. In my opinion, Jared Goff dude is underrated and bust-proof. All right, how about Alvin Kamara as well, the current running back 17 overall, and people are hopping off the bandwagon left and right when it comes to Alvin Kamara because recency bias is alive and well. He hasn't had less than 1,160 total yards in a season over his 7-year career. But last year was arguably the worst season of his career. He missed 4 games, but still finished as the running back 14 overall in half PPR and the running back 11 overall in full PPR. Jamal Williams, he only had 78 touches last year in games in which Alvin Kamara was active, so his role isn't overly scary. I see a lot of people out there talking about Kendre Miller. He may be the future, but currently he's 3rd on the depth chart. This is still the backfield of Alvin Kamara. He's had 250 plus touches in 6 of his 7 years in the league. He has never averaged under 12.2 fantasy points per game in his career, and that's in half PPR scoring. Even in a season where he missed 4 games last year, he was still top 10 among all running backs in targets, red zone targets, receiving yards, receptions, and yards per route run. So what does Alvin Kamara need to accomplish to return draft value at the running back 17 spot? Well, on average, the running back 17 scores 186.7 fantasy points per year. Heck, even in Alvin Kamara's worst year last year, he scored 195.5 fantasy points. So what does that look like in form of a stat line with a player like Alvin Kamara to reach 186.7 fantasy points? It's going to put him in the neighborhood of 1,150 total yards, 7 touchdowns, and 60 receptions. Well, over the last 3 years, he's averaged 1,295 total yards, 6 total touchdowns, and 60 receptions a season. On average, 195.5 fantasy points per season. And let's not forget either, we're talking about a Saints offense that isn't overly stacked with offensive weapons. Derek Carr, on average, throws or checks down, whatever you want to call it, to his running backs 120 plus times a season. We know that Kamara is entering the year healthy. He's still only 29 years old and doesn't have 1 year in his career with more than 287 total touches in a season. There are still tread on these tires when it comes to Alvin Kamara, and now he can be your running back 3 on your roster in 2024. He may not be what he used to be, but at running back 17, dude is bust proof. But we got another running back. It's Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans, another player people are just jumping ship on here because of what happened last season. Even more probably recency bias involved this year with Tony Pollard than what we just talked about with Alvin Kamara. But Tony Pollard has 3 straight years over 1,000 total yards. He's a great pass catcher out of the backfield. He has a career catch percentage of 77.2%. He's also averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game over the last 3 years. But now he's in Tennessee, and there are over 300 touches available in this backfield of the Tennessee Titans after the departure of Derrick Henry. They brought him over in free agency by a new coaching regime, and that is something to definitely pay attention to. They brought him in. He wasn't already there, and now they got to figure out how to use him. They wanted Tony Pollard, and they paid him $10 million guaranteed. Sure, Tajay Spears is in this backfield with him, but that is a good thing. Like we said last year numerous times when we warned people about drafting Tony Pollard, if you overwork him between the tackles, he's going to lose efficiency. We saw it happen with our own eyes last year. So now, we know we have a split backfield, but what kind of stat line do we need to build for Tony Pollard? Because he's the current running back 26 overall. Well, on average, the running back 26 scores 155 fantasy points per year. That number right there is 40 points less than Pollard scored last year in an overall disappointing season. But like I said, let's look at the stat line for 155 total fantasy points. It's going to put him in the neighborhood of 1,050 total yards, 5 total touchdowns, and 40 receptions. Over the last 3 years, Tony Pollard has averaged 1,250 total yards, 6 total touchdowns a year, and 44 receptions per season. That comes out to be an average of 183 fantasy points a year, almost 30 points higher than what the RB26 normally scores, which is where he's being drafted. Now he finds himself in an offense in Tennessee, which is overall improved and going to score more points in 2024. And if they're scoring more points, it means they're scoring more touchdowns, which means the players on the offense are scoring those touchdowns as well. More touchdown opportunity going the way of Tony Pollard is not a bad thing. We have a new head coach in Brian Callahan, who came over from Cincinnati. They have a trio of wide receivers in DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd. Boxes are no longer going to be stacked against this Tennessee team, but mostly because we also have an unproven second-year quarterback in Will Levis. They need to take some pressure off of this kid. How do you do that? The best possible way is to have an effective running game. So I'm going to go ahead and just say it. Tony Pollard at running back 26 is bust-proof. Which then brings us to a wide receiver. It's Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the current wide receiver 35 overall. And I've talked about Chris Godwin a couple times this offseason, but I'm going to keep hammering the point home because the dude's still sitting at wide receiver 35. He's had 1,000+ yards receiving in 4 of the last 5 years. The 1 year he didn't was in 2020 when he missed 4 games that season. He's had 125+ targets in 3 years straight, 80+ receptions in 3 years straight. He's averaged 11.7 fantasy points per game 3 years straight. Now he's moving back to the slot full-time in 2024, though, and that is definitely a sight for sore eyes when it comes to Chris Godwin. We saw late in 2023 the success from Chris Godwin and Baker Mayfield. Why did we see that late in 2023? It's because they put Chris Godwin back in the slot. And we've already heard this year from Tampa Bay that that's where he's going to stay to start the season. We know Mike Evans is going to be out there commanding top defensive attention. So what does Chris Godwin need to accomplish in the form of a stat line to return wide receiver 35 value? Well, on average, the wide receiver 35 scores 149.2 fantasy points per year. Chris Godwin had 18 more points than that just last season. The guy scored over 149.2 fantasy points in 6 straight years, even with missed games. However, just to get to 149.2 fantasy points, he's going to need around 70 catches for 900 yards and 4 touchdowns. So with his career catch percentage of 70%, he's going to need 100 targets to get to 70 catches. He's had 120+ targets in 4 of the last 5 years. He's had over 70 catches 4 of the last 5 years. Had over 1,000 yards 4 of the last 5 years. For his career, he's averaging 5 touchdowns a season. And despite all of that, people think he's going to have the worst season of his career since his rookie year in 2017, where he only got 55 targets. And it's not like the guy is overly old. He's 28 years old, and this year is a contract year. He's trying to play for one more big fat bag of cash. Now, a lot of people are going to be out there saying, yeah, but they drafted Jalen McMillan in the 3rd round. That's great. He's the Godwin replacement in 2025. I just can't stress enough the fact that Godwin in the slot is a great thing for fantasy football, and we already know that Baker looks his way when he's in the slot. That's why Chris Godwin ended 2023 so hot. So where you can get Chris Godwin this year at wide receiver 35, it makes him bust-proof. But let me end you with some of the best advice that I can give you when it comes to fantasy football. Because every single year at the end of a season, players are going to be labeled as busts. But are they really a bust? Or did the person who made the projections come up with some outlandish number and then it makes it look like the player did worse than they really did? Because let me tell you this, Tony Pollard wasn't a bust for us last year because we didn't have him ranked as high as so many other people. Find out what value they need to return. If the numbers you come up with are pretty legit numbers that you think they have a great opportunity to attain, that's when you draft the players. Listening to people with half-assed opinions and a bunch of I thinks and I feel likes doesn't score you fantasy football points. Because a player can't bust if you build realistic projections. But I want to know what you think right now down below in the comment section. When you hear the term bust-proof, how do you define that? When you apply it to 2024, who are some of the players that you look at and think, you know what, those guys are bust-proof? Would love to have those conversations with you guys down below in the comment section. Don't forget, if you haven't hit the like button already, now is the time to do so. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, now is the time to do so. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day, but I really hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.